This is Brian at ScreenFiles.com in review. What I'm looking at today is 2020's The Deep Ones, directed by Chad Farron. And if you're like me, you're probably very hesitant about H.P. Lovecraft adaptations. And unfortunately, this is not a very good one. For a start, there is no H.P. Lovecraft story that I can recall called The Deep Ones. The Deep Ones are characters that exist within Lovecraft's mythos, his Cthulhu mythos. But stories don't really tend to center around them. They are involved in things, but they're almost like drones, really. And so action doesn't tend to be focused around them. For instance, the whole Innsmouth story revolves around essentially a town filled with deep ones, though they're not the center of things. Keep in mind, Lovecraft was very much a writer of cosmic horror, beings like Yog-Sothoth, Cthulhu, Dagon, Hastur, or Lathotep. These entities spawned with humans, particularly those of Cthulhu, and the Deep Ones came into being. And so, right off the bat, I was leery about this movie, for that reason in particular. And having seen it, I was right, because this is less an H.P. Lovecraft movie, or an H.P. Lovecraft-based movie, than a weird combination of Rosemary's Baby and Humanoids from the Deep. Which is a pity, because one of the better H.P. Lovecraft adaptations, John Carpenter's In the Mouth of Madness, is not a Lovecraft adaptation per se, but it tends to get it a little bit more than most movies do. And it does a heck of a lot better than The Deep Ones. The Deep Ones revolves around this couple who are chosen by the inhabitants of this seaside community, who just happen to be a cult worshipping Dagon, one of the entities in the Cthulhu mythos. Now, there's nothing wrong with this in and of itself, but it's the way the movie approaches it that's the problem. As I said, it treats it as if this were Rosemary's Baby, but really weird, in that there are lots of quirky, weird neighbors, blatantly weird, not that Innsmouth look weird. So it's kind of got a very off-kilter feel, which wouldn't be a bad thing if it weren't adapting H.P. Lovecraft, which just doesn't tend to do this at all. And part of the problem is that, well, I should say part of the problem with adapting H.P. Lovecraft in general is that people who do so haven't read Lovecraft, or at best have a very cursory knowledge of Lovecraft. So, therefore, they kind of make very generic films with Lovecraft's name pasted on them. At least Chad Farron, who wrote as well as directed, on some level gets Lovecraft, and that's always good to see. The problem is, though, he doesn't get it enough, because if you follow Lovecraft at all, you're probably aware that he was a bit of a racist. The thing is, he wasn't particularly fond of yellow people, brown people, black people, and what's really fascinating, though, is he put that fear of the other, the unknown, into his writing. When Lovecraft talks about the Innsmouth look, that's what he's talking about. There's that underpinning of racial hatred. It runs through a lot of his stories, particularly the more human level stories, which this is kind of basing itself upon. So without being cognizant or willfully ignoring that fact, you're not going to adapt H.P. Lovecraft very well. And Chad Farron doesn't seem to want to deal with that. So if you ignore that, you ignore what makes Lovecraft truly Lovecraft, and you get movies like this, which is essentially almost Humanoids of the Deep-ish, particularly in their depiction of Dagon. Which isn't to say that the old ones is bad. It's not bad. It's just not Lovecraft either. And I wish directors and writers would stop putting their own special little twist on Lovecraft. Adapt it as H.P. Lovecraft writes it. And once that becomes more well-known among more people, then you can start to play with the formula a little bit and tweak it. Most people, if they're even aware of Lovecraft at all, aren't terribly familiar with his work. And releasing things like this don't really help with that. It's just not a great thing. And in relation to the movie itself, it's terribly inconsistent in the way it depicts these entities. On one hand, you have among these cultists, people who are seemingly changing into deep ones. They have web hands and odd facial features and that type of thing. On the other hand, you have people possessed by entities of light. It's very un-H.P. Lovecraft, in fact, and I don't quite know why that is. And I don't know if I want to say there's a gay subtext to this movie, and on the whole, there isn't. But at the same time, there's a scene where our protagonist is essentially throat-fucked by a tentacle. It's weird. Even in the scheme of the movie, I don't understand it. It just doesn't make sense. It's a very odd scene, and seems to be there for shock value more than anything else, because I don't understand what it's supposed to be doing. Now, if there were a context for it, it would at least be something that would be interesting on some level, in that it's, as depicted, pretty repulsive, but there would be a logic to it, and I could roll with that. There is none that I could see, and therefore that makes it just really icky for no real reason but ickiness. So that's not a great thing. And the deep ones, while watchable, it's not terrible by any stretch, is not a very good Lovecraft adaptation. And as I said earlier, there is no story that I'm aware of written by H.P. Lovecraft called The Deep Ones. And if I'm wrong, please correct me. Though, the way this is depicted... Oh, and I forgot to mention, there's another movie that this resembles. I mentioned Rosemary's Baby, I mentioned Humanoids from the Deep, and there's The Howling. In fact, the plot of this is very similar to The Howling, which is odd, and I don't know why, but that's not to say that it's a copy of The Howling. I'm not saying that at all. What I am saying, the plot is very similar to The Howling, and it shouldn't be, because if you've read Lovecraft and you're trying to adapt it somewhat faithfully, it shouldn't look like The Howling. So what do you think? This is Brian with ScreenFiles.com and Review. If you agree, disagree, let me know down below. And as usual, consider a like or a follow. Peace.